The attorney leaned in, the fabric of his expensive suit rustling against the silence of the courtroom, and whispered a mere 5 words. Just 5. Yet those words possessed the power to dismantle a man. I watched Julian's face, that smug, sculpted mask of self-assurance I had memorized over 15 years of marriage, drain of all color. It was as if the blood had simply ceased to flow in his veins. His hands, previously resting on the mahogany table with the arrogance of a conqueror, began to tremor. The documents he had been so desperate to sign, the very papers he believed were his ticket to freedom and fortune, rattled against the wood like dry leaves in a gale. And there, sitting quietly on the other side of the aisle, for the first time in 3 agonizing years, I allowed the corner of my mouth to lift. I smiled. But I am getting ahead of the narrative. To truly appreciate the devastation of that moment, you must understand the architecture of the collapse. You need to know how a woman, whom the world had dismissed as broken and discarded, executed the most patient, silent checkmate of her life. My name is Elena Cross. I am 34 years old, and until 90 days ago, I was Mrs. Julian Thorne. 15 years. That is a span of time longer than most celebrity marriages, longer than the lifespans of some empires, and certainly longer than my resilience should have endured. But tenacity runs in my bloodline. I inherited a spine of steel from my grandmother, a woman who knew the value of silence. I met Julian when I was merely 17. I had bypassed the final dreg of high school, graduating early not out of sheer brilliance, but out of a desperate practical need to escape my childhood home. I secured a position at the prestigious law firm of Sterling & Price as a file clerk. It was grueling work, minimum wage, paper cuts that stung like insults, and the invisibility of being at the bottom of the ladder. But it was mine. By 18, I had clawed my way up to legal assistant. I possessed a talent for the minutia, for the numbers that didn't add up, for keeping my mouth shut while my eyes devoured everything. Julian was 24 when our paths crossed at a firm gala. He was kinetic energy in a bespoke suit, charming, ravenous for success, spinning tales of a real estate dynasty he intended to build. He spoke of the future with such certainty as if it were a package already in the mail, waiting to be delivered. He declared he was going to construct a legacy. I told him I could organize the permits. Romance, in its most pragmatic form. We married when I was 19. Leo arrived a year later. I continued to work at the law firm part-time, balancing the demands of a newborn with the necessity of building my 401k, hoarding every spare cent. My grandmother's voice was a constant echo in my mind. A woman must have her own purse, Elena. Not hidden, just hers. A fortress no one else holds the key to. When I turned 23, Julian's ambitions finally ignited into reality. He asked me to resign from the firm to manage his operations full-time. He needed a shadow partner, someone to balance the ledgers, charm the investors, wrangle the contractors, and manage the chaos. He needed someone whose loyalty was absolute. So I became his unpaid workforce. I was the bookkeeper, the office manager, the diplomat, the interior designer for the model units, the marketing department, and the event planner. I performed these miracles while raising Leo, managing our domestic life, and ensuring that Julian's world remained frictionless. My official title was wife. My actual job description was everything else. For 11 years, I poured my soul into the foundation of Julian's dream. And for 11 years, he stood in the spotlight, accepting the accolades. At every industry gala, I was merely the decorative accessory on his arm. At every victory dinner, he toasted his genius, his mentors, his vision. He never quite found the time to toast the woman who kept the lights on. The erosion was slow, almost imperceptible, like water wearing down stone. He began making unilateral decisions. The late nights at the office became frequent, then constant. The criticism started, subtle at first, then sharp. He critiqued my attire, my culinary efforts, and most painfully, my lack of ambition. I was running the engine room of his life for 0 salary while raising his heir, yet I was deemed insufficiently driven. Then, 3 months ago, he detonated the nuclear option. He arrived home on a Tuesday. The scent of rosemary roasted chicken, his favorite, filled the kitchen, a testament to my pathetic desire to please him. He sat me down at the breakfast nook, his expression devoid of sorrow or remorse. It was purely transactional. "I want a dissolution as marriage," he stated, as casually as one might order coffee. "And regarding the settlement, I want the house, the luxury vehicles, the business, the entire portfolio. You can keep Leo." He listed the terms like items on a grocery receipt. "I will take the assets, you may have the child." He spoke of our 15-year-old son as if he were a piece of depreciation, an inconvenience he was graciously permitting me to retain. I sat frozen, staring at him across the granite countertop. 15 years of devotion, and this was the eulogy delivered between the salt and pepper shakers. What I did not know in that frozen second, but would discover shortly, was that Julian had been architecting this exit for months. He had retained Marcus Sterling, a shark of a lawyer known for scorched earth tactics. I had been plotting his liberation while I was scheduling his dental cleanings. I had been blindsided by the man I had built a life around. The following day, the cavalry arrived in the form of his mother. Beatrice Thorne, a woman who had viewed me as little more than hired help for a decade and a half, swept in with her chemically frozen hair and rehearsed sympathy. She patted my hand with ice-cold fingers and suggested that perhaps if I had tried harder to maintain my allure, this wouldn't have happened. "Men have complex needs, darling," she cooed, sounding like she was explaining quantum physics to a toddler. Beatrice's advice on marital bliss was rich, considering her own husband spent his entire life on the golf course to avoid the suffocating atmosphere of their home. But in her narrative, I was the failure. The first week was a hallucinatory blur. Julian relocated me to the guest quarters. He had the paperwork drafted, the timeline set. The velocity of it was designed to disorient me. Everyone saw a woman whose universe had imploded, a loyal wife discarded like yesterday's newspaper. They saw a victim. But here is the secret that no one, absolutely no one, suspected. I had discovered something 3 years prior, something very deep within the forensic details of his financial records, and I had been quietly, methodically, sharpening my knife ever since. Before we delve deeper into the darkness, if this story is resonating with you, please take a moment to subscribe and let me know in the comments where you are watching from. Your support fuels these narrations. Now, back to the wreckage. Within 7 days of the announcement, Julian's occupation of our life was total. My walk-in closet was annexed. I was relegated to a few hangers in the guest room. The message was explicit. "You are a guest in my empire." 2 weeks in, the replacement arrived. Chloe, 27 years possessing the polished gloss of an Instagram filter. She was a junior associate at his firm, a cliché so tired it barely warranted an eye roll. She had perfectly manicured nails and wore athleisure that cost more than my monthly grocery budget. She breezed into my kitchen with the confidence of a landlord, donning my grandmother's vintage apron to blend kale smoothies in my blender. She was younger than the duration of my marriage, but she made excellent smoothies, so apparently that balanced the scales. Julian paraded her like a newly acquired exotic car. They would lounge on my sofa, watching my television, eating from my wedding china. He would drape his arm around her, looking through me as if I were a ghost haunting the hallways. The humiliation was a daily ritual. First, my personal credit cards were severed. Separation of finances, he claimed, feigning reasonableness. Then the joint accounts were frozen. Then came the suggestion that I should find temporary housing. Beatrice arrived to assist with the packing, which essentially meant she acted as a customs officer, deciding what I was permitted to take. Old sweaters, fine. Family albums, a select few. My grandmother's wooden recipe box? She paused over that, seemingly weighing its value before tossing it into the approved pile. But the jewelry Julian had gifted me, the art I had selected, marital assets, forbidden. She packed my life into heavy-duty black garbage bags. Not boxes, garbage bags. I was trash being taken to the curb. Throughout this purgatory, I believed I had one ally, Sarah. We had been inseparable since high school, 20 years of shared secrets, heartbreaks, and milestones. She was my first call. She was the shoulder I wept on, a voice of righteous indignation. She brought wine and cursed Julian's name. But intuition is a funny thing. It whispers before it screams. Small discrepancies began to surface. Julian seemed to anticipate my moves before I made them. I mentioned to Sarah I might fight for the house. The next day, Leo reported that his father laughed about how futile that would be. I mentioned a specific apartment complex. Julian made a snide remark about that exact neighborhood being out of my price range. Then the realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. I watched Sarah interacting with him one afternoon, the way her face illuminated when he entered the room, the excessive laughter at his mediocre jokes, the way she always asked, "How is Julian?" before asking, "How are you?" She had been harboring an unrequited infatuation for 15 years, and Julian, a collector of egos, knew exactly how to weaponize it. He had fed her crumbs of attention, perhaps hinted at a future where they could finally be together, just to turn my best friend into a surveillance device. 20 years of sisterhood, traded for a wink from a narcissist. But the deepest cut wasn't Julian or Beatrice or even Sarah. It was Leo. My son was the collateral damage. He witnessed the younger woman, the grandmother packing his mother's life into trash bags, the cold indifference of his father. And Julian was working on him, dripping poison into his ear. "Your mother is being difficult, Leo. I want peace, but she's dragging this out. I'm trying to be generous." Leo began to withdraw, his eyes filled with confusion and a quiet resentment. He didn't know who to trust, and his father was a master salesman. Watching my son look at me as if I were the villain was the only wound that truly bled. I retained counsel, Evelyn Sharp, 52 years old, with eyes like flint and a reputation for eviscerating unparalleled egos. She reviewed the case and laid out a war plan. "You built that company," she said, her voice hard. "You are entitled to 50%, the equity, the accounts, the real estate. We go to war." I looked at her, silence stretching between us. What if I don't want to fight? Evelyn stared at me as if I had spoken in tongues.
She thought I was broken, another battered wife too exhausted to claim her due. She didn't see the board. She didn't know the game I was playing. I moved into a cramped 2-bedroom apartment with Leo. The kitchen was the size of a closet. Half our boxes remained unpacked, towering in the corner like monuments to our displacement. Meanwhile, Julian posted photos with Chloe. New beginnings, blessed. Beatrice commented, "Finally, you have the joy you deserve." My sister called, screaming that I needed to unleash hell. Everyone had an opinion. Everyone saw a woman who had folded. Everyone was wrong. There is a distinct advantage to being underestimated. People stop watching you. They stop guarding the gates. And that is when you walk right in. 3 years. That is how long I had carried the truth. It began on a Tuesday night, exactly 3 years prior to the divorce demand. Julian was working late, a euphemism I hadn't yet decoded. I was reconciling the company books, doing the unglamorous forensic accounting that kept us afloat. I noticed a transfer, an anomaly, then another. Money was bleeding out of the company accounts into entities I didn't recognize. I dug. I stayed up until the sky turned gray, following the digital trail. What I unearthed made the blood freeze in my veins. Julian had leveraged everything. The house, our pristine, envied estate, was mortgaged 30 times over. The original loan, a second taken 4 years ago, and a third taken 2 years ago. We owed $1.1 million on a property worth $850,000. We were underwater by $250,000 on the home I thought was our sanctuary. The business was a catastrophe. Lines of credit were maxed out. Vendor debts were suffocating. Back taxes were unpaid. The empire Julian bragged about was a shell, hollowed out by debt. Even the luxury cars were leased, with massive balloon payments looming. I did the math in the cold light of dawn. Total debt, nearly $2 million. Total assets, maybe $1.6 million on a generous day. We were technically insolvent. Where had the money gone? I traced that too. Crypto schemes that evaporated, high-stakes gambling, an apartment rented across town, $60,000 in rent and furnishings for a mistress I hadn't even known about then. Lifestyle expenses, watches, suits, vacations I never took. My husband wasn't a tycoon. He was a fraudster building a castle out of matchsticks. My instinct was to scream, to confront him, but I knew Julian. He would spin it. He would gaslight me, blame me, or worse, seize control of the one thing I had left. See, I had listened to my grandmother. A woman must have her own purse. I had kept my IRA from my law firm days separate, rolling it over but never touching it. It had grown to $180,000. And then, when Grandma passed, she left me $340,000 with a specific clause. For Elena alone, I had never commingled these funds. Legally, they were separate property. I had roughly $500,000 that was mine. So I didn't scream. I plotted. I worked with my uncle, a retired forensic accountant, to establish an irrevocable trust for Leo. My retirement and my inheritance went into that trust. It was locked down, bulletproof, designated for Leo's education and future. Julian couldn't touch it. I couldn't even touch it easily. Then I documented everything, every mortgage deed, every loan agreement, every gambling loss. I made copies, encrypted drives, and stored them in safety deposit boxes. And then I waited. I knew the discard was coming. Men like Julian always need a new audience eventually. I just had to be ready. 3 years of smiling at dinner parties, knowing we were bankrupt. 3 years of watching him dig the hole deeper. When he finally demanded the house and the business, I almost laughed. He wasn't demanding wealth. He was demanding an anchor. He just didn't know he was already drowning. Back in Evelyn Sharp's office, I placed 3 heavy binders on her desk. 3 years of evidence, I said. Evelyn read in silence for an hour. When she looked up, the pity was gone, replaced by a terrifying respect. "You knew," she whispered. "You're letting him take it all." "He wants the assets," I said calmly, "so he gets the liabilities attached to them. If I walk away with a small cash settlement and he signs for the whole estate, he assumes the debt solely. My separate property is already in trust." Evelyn leaned back, a shark-like grin spreading across her face. "Mrs. Cross," she said, "I believe I have severely underestimated you. I thought you were a victim. You're a grand master." "I prefer the term survivor," I replied. The next 3 months were a performance worthy of an Academy Award. I became the weeping, broken woman everyone expected. I attended mediation with red-rimmed eyes and a trembling voice. I asked for so little that the mediator looked uncomfortable. "I just want enough to start over," I whimpered. "I don't want to ruin his business. It's his life's work." I requested $50,000 cash, my personal effects, and shared custody of Leo. That was it. Julian agreed so fast it was almost insulting. He had expected a war for half. Instead, I was surrendering. He looked at me with contemptuous pity. As the weeks passed, Julian's arrogance swelled to dangerous levels. He told his golf buddies I had no fight. Lorraine bragged at her bridge club that I was walking away with nothing. "That woman was never strong enough for my son," she declared. To celebrate, Julian bought a $15,000 watch using company funds, another nail in his coffin. He took Chloe to our anniversary restaurant. He was living the high life on borrowed time and borrowed dimes. Chloe began redecorating my house. She painted my sage green kitchen, a color I had spent weeks choosing, a soulless, builder-grade gray. It was fitting. Gray like her personality, gray like the ash that would soon be left of Julian's life. Sarah kept calling, fishing for dirt. "I just want it to be over," I told her, my voice cracking. "I can't fight him." She relayed this to Julian immediately, and I could practically feel him relaxing. But Leo was watching. My son noticed the new watch, the complaints about money for his school trip, the shopping bags. He came to my tiny apartment one evening and asked, "Mom, is that actually Rich?" I squeezed his hand. "Trust me, just wait." Evelyn drafted the final agreement. It stated clearly that I relinquished all claims to marital property, but attached was an addendum, a liability disclosure statement. It listed every debt, every mortgage, every loan. By signing for the assets, Julian was legally assuming sole responsibility for the attached liabilities. It was airtight. 2 weeks before the hearing, Julian's lawyer, Marcus, called Evelyn. He was nervous. He wanted a financial audit. "My client is taking on a lot," he said. When Marcus presented this to Julian, Julian exploded. "No audits. I know what my company is worth. I'm not paying an accountant to tell me I'm rich. She's giving up. Sign the papers." Marcus, covering his own back, made Julian sign a waiver stating he was refusing the audit against legal advice. Julian signed it without reading. He was too busy texting Chloe. The night before the hearing, Julian texted me, "Thanks for not making this ugly." I replied, "I just want what is best for Leo." And I meant it. Thursday morning, courtroom 4B. The air smelled of floor wax and impending doom.
Julian arrived in a charcoal suit, looking like the king of the world. Chloe waited in the hall. Beatrice sat in the gallery, smirking. I wore a plain navy dress, hair in a bun, looking faded. Judge Holden, a veteran of family court, reviewed the file. Mrs. Cross, you are walking away from substantial assets. Are you sure? Yes, Your Honor, I said softly. I just want peace. The judge looked skeptical, but proceeded. The papers were passed. Julian signed with a flourish, barely glancing at the pages. I signed slowly, savoring the ink hitting the paper. Then Marcus Sterling did his final review. He flipped to the addendum, the liability disclosure. I watched his face go pale. He leaned in. Sir, he whispered. The atmosphere shifted. Not now, Julian hissed. Sir, you are assuming personal liability for everything. Marcus pointed to the numbers. Julian looked. He saw the mortgages, the business debts, the totals. Total debt, $1.9 million. Net asset value, negative $300,000. He hadn't won a fortune. He had inherited an avalanche. This is wrong, Julian stood up, panic rising in his voice. She hid this. This is fraud.
Sit down, Mr. Thorne, Judge Holden snapped. These numbers are fake. Mr. Thorne, the judge said, icy and calm. These are debts attached to your assets. Are you telling me you don't know the state of your own business? Silence. Marcus cleared his throat. Your Honor, I advised a financial review. The client signed a waiver declining it. He held up the waiver. The judge looked at Julian. You signed the waiver? You declined the audit? I thought... The agreement stands. Judge Holden banged the gavel. Mrs. Cross, you have your settlement. Mr. Thorne, you have the assets and the liabilities. Case closed. I stood up. Julian was slumped in his chair, looking like a man who had just been told the world was ending. You said you wanted everything, I said quietly as I passed him. I gave you exactly what you asked for. I walked out. In the hallway, I heard him screaming at Marcus. I saw Chloe's face change as she listened to the shouting. She realized the gravy train had just derailed. She was gone before I reached the elevator. The collapse was swift. Within 2 weeks, Chloe moved out. Within a month, the foreclosure notices started. The business imploded under the weight of the lawsuits and frozen credit lines. Julian, the empire builder, was filing for bankruptcy. Beatrice was calling relatives begging for loans, claiming I had tricked him. But the signatures were his. The debts were his. Sarah tried to call me. I didn't know, she sobbed. I blocked her number. Some betrayals are final. Leo came to me a month later. He sat in my sage green kitchen. I had repainted the apartment to match my soul. You knew, he said. You waited to protect me. Always, I said. He hugged me. A real tight hug. 3 months later, a knock on the door. Julian. He looked aged, broken, suit wrinkled. I made mistakes, he rasped. Can we talk? Maybe you can help me fix this? I looked at him. The man who treated me like an employee. The man who threw me away. You got what you wanted, Julian, I said. Goodbye. I closed the door. I watched through the peephole as he stood there, defeated, before walking away down the dim hallway. I sat back down on my sofa, in my small, quiet, peaceful sanctuary. I looked at my grandmother's recipe box on the shelf. You were right, Grandma, I whispered. Know your worth and keep your own purse. I was free. Thank you for listening to this story of justice served cold. If you felt that ending in your bones, please hit that like button. It helps more than you know. And if you haven't subscribed yet, join us. I have so many more stories to tell, and you won't want to miss what comes next. Share this with someone who needs a reminder that sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one holding all the cards. Until next time.